and welcome tonight. I am Kara, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the Oregon Public Library, and I'm very excited to have 3 Wisconsin authors with us tonight. They write history and fiction and nonfiction, and you'll be hearing more about them and what they write. So we have this panel tonight, and I'll be serving as moderator. If you have any questions throughout the session, feel free to, jump in and ask your question. We will probably rephrase it, paraphrase it, so that we can capture it for the recording that we're doing tonight. And if anybody's watching from home, you should have gotten my contact information so that you can ask a question by emailing me. Anything else before we get started? Okay, here we go. Here is first to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the type of books you write. Let's just start with that.
Okay. My name is Marggie Moertl, and I have self-published 2 nonfiction books in the past. I'm an end-of-life doula and Reiki master, so my writing is very much centered on, or it was centered on those issues in the past. I'm currently just starting my first fiction novel, baby steps, but having a lot of fun taking my content and being able to make a story out of it and really play with it a little bit. So it's going to be a while, but it's it's in process, so thank you.
I'm Peggy Joque Williams, and my maiden name Joque is misspelled French, and there's a research story behind that. We can talk about that later. I have co-written and self-published 2 mystery novels that they're contemporary mysteries, but the clues and the solutions have to do with history. So there was a lot of research into these. And then I have independently written, my first solo historical novel is Courting the Sun, which takes place in 17th century France in the court of Louis XIV. He was called the Sun King. And it was very loosely inspired by my own family ancestry, my genealogy. My ancestors did not live quite the life that this young woman lived. But I just signed the contract for the sequel to this book, which takes this character from France over to New France, Quebec, Canada, and that's where my ancestors were. And the journey she took to get there is very similar to my ancestors, so a lot of research in that.
Oh, I'm Lynda Drews, and I started out by writing nonfiction, actually true crime, because after my best running friend died mysteriously when I was working at IBM, I always knew I had to tell this story, and I was part of a first-degree, murder trial and all that kind of thing. So that was my first book, but then I got the writing bug and started to do 2 fiction, but I always still say you do write what you know. So I still was writing something about Door County. This was the first one. This was a Door County book because we have a place in Door County and I'm familiar with that area. So that's why I wrote that one. I wrote another international woman's mystery. I worked at IBM, so I used some of that knowledge. And then my latest one is the one that is I'm still doing really well around. I'm from Green Bay, and this is the Maid and the Socialite. I uncovered 2 women's stories that have never been told about a big doctor in town, and changed Green Bay's history, the perception of their history now. So those are the things I work on.
Okay. All right, so writing. Where do you get started? You have an idea and there's some questions, but how do you dig into researching something that you're planning on writing?
Anywhere, anyone.
I'll go first. For me, the writing often comes out of the research. So for the historical fiction, it came out of my research into my family history and learning about a group of women that came. They were recruited in France. They were called the Filles du Roi, the Daughters of the King. And Louis XIV wanted to grow a colony, and all he had in Canada were soldiers and fur traders and a few farmers. So he recruited young women to go over, and he said he would pay their passage, he'd give them a dowry, he'd give them a trousseau, he'd pay them to have babies. And in a 10-year period back in the 1600s, just shy of 800 women took him up on this. And they're now called the Filles du Roi. And I am descendant from about 24 of those women. So that got me started on this one. The mystery novels, it was more where we had the idea and we wanted to have a touch of history. So we came up with something we thought would be an interesting backstory. And then we went and we researched for On the Road to Death's Door. We had it in the bombing of Sterling Hall in 1970, but we changed the name of the bombing. We wanted it, you know, out of respect for the family, to not have it be quite as exact. And then On the Road to Where the Bells Toll takes place in Boston, and we used Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and we used a book that had his autograph in it, his signature. And so we did a lot of research there. And I'd been to Boston quite a bit, so that just seemed like a real natural thing to be able to, easy to research because I've been there in person.
For me, most of the research that went into my nonfiction books, because I write about medical things and end of life, I certainly always did research as far as to make sure that what I'm saying is accurate, but I had to completely thing around. It had to be completely rewritten. There's no way I could tell people's stories, you know. And so to make sure that I could recreate the situations and put in all new details required looking into the different areas that I had worked in and lived in and all the different medical regulatory things of those areas and things. So that, but on my new book, it's very much a mystical, metaphysical book. It'll be fiction, but I spend my whole day, every day, always trying to stay in a certain vibration. I do a lot of meditation and vibrational practices, and so my research for my new book is a lot of exploring spiritual teachers, their different methods that they're teaching, because the characters will be using these different things. And the same thing in talking about some of the medical people or the medical situations that I'm planning to encounter. I've done a lot of research into the current hospice supportive care for different diseases and things like that. So mine is not your traditional research, but it's a lot of meditation and getting guidance and then using that. So different.
Well, and you know, I guess I'll primarily just talk about the two nonfiction, which are the ones that are actually narrative nonfiction. So they read like fiction, but they're, you know, they are nonfiction. But to get started on this, just because I had that idea about my best friend's death, the big thing was that I needed to uncover a lot of what other people felt and knew about that. So this one included many, 50 different interviews with people. So I think really getting close to people and knowing and understanding that, finding photos, all those kind of things. And then also, there was so much trial stuff in here. I had to do tons of work related to trial and knowing how they were conducted and all that kind of thing. So it's sort of like, it was interviewing and things and using a lot of microfiche back then because this was written in 2009. Okay, well now, this one is I did this, started in 2017. Now newspapers.com is around. So truthfully, for most writers now, I think that it's where you start almost first is newspapers.com. It does cost you $75 a quarter, I believe it is, but it is well worth it. It doesn't mean, though, that every newspaper is out there. In Green Bay, when I found this, now, the reason I even started this book is one of the family I was going to interview, maybe focus on, one of them had lived in my home that was a 100-year home in Green Bay. And then I uncovered these two women's stories during the research using newspapers.com initially. So I think that's a really good place to start, and that's what I do.
Yeah, so you just mentioned newspapers.com as a resource that you use in your research process. Are there other important resources that you would recommend using?
Well, certainly outside of visiting a place in person, the internet, obviously, and Google, YouTube. I've been to France, but I have not been to Versailles, where much of this story takes place. But I've been there virtually, because now you can do walkthroughs of buildings, and you can see what things look like. So I look things up on YouTube. I want to know what something looks like or sounds like. I had visited some of the sites for the Boston story, but then I needed some more information on what it looked or sounded like, and I found some videos on YouTube of people who had taken the same tour, and it was able to help me remember, what I had been through, that sort of thing. And even for the new book that I'm working on that takes place in Canada and deals with the daughters of the king, there's so much online about them. And I found a woman who's been doing a series of videos on the different women who are part of that group. And I can go to that and see what she says about what their lives were like. But books, I have tons of resource books that tell me, what things were like in the past, what other researchers have done. So, I guess those are my main resources.
Actual books.
Actual books. Yes, lots of books.
All right, so,
I could just mention the big thing that I found, especially in the latest one, is that the archives in Wisconsin are amazing for past history, especially if you're starting to work with something that is more Wisconsin related. So the Historical Society on the Madison campus, I use that extensively for a lot of my research, because the family I was working with somebody had donated 5 boxes of information for that family there, so I was able to find all sorts of things there. And then in Green Bay, there's the Area Research Center, and that is in UWGB's campus on the 7th floor there. And they have really great stuff, like I'm working on now a new book on something with Belgium history, and they got a grant there and all sorts of information there. And the resources of those people that help you there are amazing. You tell them a story or something you're going to focus on, they dig in and they know all these other resources around the state to help you and find information for you. And then they will bring it in for you into the locale where you're at, instead of you having to travel all the time.
Ooh, librarians too.
Yes, they're librarians.
So as you gather information, you've mentioned several resources, interviews, and all types of different ways to gather information. How do you keep it organized, and how do you access it again? What note system are you using, or is there one?
I use Word primarily. I know there's lots of writing platforms and stuff, but I find it easier because that's what I'm most comfortable in. And I have a main file for the book, and then all the different subject matters in there, so that I can move it all around anytime I want. But I really start originally with just a great big thick binder. And as I get ideas, I have places in there that I keep track of them there, and then refer back for character development and what my main plan for the book is, and beginning, middle, and end, things like that. I like to do it in just handwriting and stuff. So
I ended up with the same. I've tried a couple of different programs. I've tried Scrivener and, a couple different things that will help you collect notes and help you keep everything. But I ended up going right back to Word and just creating my own files. But the thing that I have found that I do is I'm really obsessive about sourcing my notes. For one thing is sometimes I don't remember what is real and what I made up. And so if I source it, I can go back and check. And I will sometimes grab, a whole piece of information and just copy it into a document, but I always put the URL and then put whoever the author is in the title, because sometimes the URLs will go defunct and you need to find other ways to do it. But I have a general file for my the historical fiction, and then I have sub-files for each of the books, and then I have sub-files for general notes, and then within that I have sub-files for categories of notes. And for me, that just works well.
Same, you know what? You can get really into tools and all these kind of things, and then you're almost playing with tools too much instead of using something that is simple, like Word. I'd use it too. But I use, heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, so that I make things really organized, with on the left side where you can show that, and so I can go move around easily. Same thing here. I always make sure I put all my citations in immediately, because it's hard later. You wrote something, you've got it even in quotes, and you cannot find it again. So it's extremely important to always put your citations, but I have a separate citation document I always have. I don't organize it yet, I just start sticking them in there late and then later do it. But I put absolutely everything else in one big document, because then I can just search really easy for something in one document instead of going to all sorts of different folders and things. I think it's easier that way. And usually I do things in my I start out chronologically, so I go a lot by dates, but then later when you start to write it, you might do backstories and pull some of that into a different spot, but at least chronologically you know the way it works. That's the way I do it.
So we've talked a lot about facts and the hard research of it. But how do you balance facts with storyline? For example, how do you create a compelling narrative that will drive the reader forward, rather than an encyclopedia entry with just fact, So how do you balance all that in the writing process?
Some of my early drafts sound like that. They sound like encyclopedia entries. It's like, oh, I want you to know all this about Louis XIV, or I want you to know all this about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And then as I go through, I realize that, oh yeah, that isn't needed. But what is needed is what's the kind of information that will inform how the characters act and how the characters react. What is the kind of information that sets the setting for what the characters live in? And I think anytime you do historical fiction, you're going to be taking literary license. You're going to be playing a little bit with dates. You're going to be maybe creating characters that weren't there and not using characters that were there, or combining characters, which I think is very different from narrative fiction.
Mm-hmm. Right. When I do narrative fiction, no created characters, and I do not do any created dialogue. So the way I do it is that in my archival research, where I find quoted things, I bring it in to the storyline and make it flow with the character and put that in there. But then I still will say, you can take liberty in nonfiction to say that I have imagined scenes and thoughts of the characters. The scenes and thoughts you can imagine if it's in the past and nobody's ever recorded it, and it makes it come alive and be, you're in the scene instead of being very dry historical dialogue. But that is, you can still do that in nonfiction, and a lot of people don't realize you can. But if it was like Mamie Eisenhower, you probably cannot. But mine's a Maid and a Socialite that nobody knows about, right? And so there's no written documents on that in that era, but I can assume it from the, the archival research, okay? So that you can make it come alive, okay?
Before I started this fiction book, I took a class on character development so that I could really get a grasp on how to do it. And so that has been very helpful. That was step one, I will go back to all of those notes because I'm just getting my story out right now. But then to make it come alive and put in some conflict and some movement into the story, you have to add that for sure.
But sometimes what you find out, what you discover that went on, can help you add scenes that then can help with the story. So like one of the things I found out about Louis XIV is he loved to dance. And I'm not talking ballroom dance, I'm talking ballet. He would get up there and he'd be dressed in gold costume, and his favorite mistress would also be in the dance, and his brother Philippe was in the dance, and some of the noble men and women might take part in it. He was considered to be a very good dancer, very fluid, very athletic. And so it was like, oh my gosh, that is so visual. So I found a way to put it into the story so that it's not just a thing that happened. It helps drive something else that happens in the story. It helps set the scene for something else that's going on. But then I was able to use that.
So when you're writing dialogue for a specific time period, how do you know what words and phrases were commonly used during that time? And how do you figure that out?
Well, mine is in present time, so that's easy.
Yeah. But even in your memoir, it must go back a little bit and...
Not that far back,
Okay.
yeah. But just, in my lifetime, so yeah, just nothing special, It's very different.
Yeah. For me, one of the things that I did is I didn't use a lot of colloquial language. I kind of straddled between what a modern reader would enjoy reading and then some things that come from the past. I did a lot of reading of things at the time. So the time that my story takes place, there was a lot of writing going on, a lot of letter writing between people. One of the princesses of court at the time was known for writing like a dozen letters a day or whatever, and they've been preserved and they're in books. They're translated because she wrote them in French and some in German. And there were things that went on, there were newspapers at the time, so I could get a flavor for what it was. In terms of the absolute vocabulary and language, there are dictionaries. A lot of people I know use the Oxford Dictionary to tell you when a word first appeared, but I found online the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and I think that's regular dictionary will do this, but they have one called the Time Traveler. And it will tell you the first time a word appears in the literature. And you can kind of assume that the word is being used for a decade, maybe 2 decades, even more before it first appears in the literature. But at least you get an idea, oh yeah, they never called it this, something, I wanted croissants. Well, croissants didn't come into being until like the late 1800s, and my story takes place in the late 1600s. So I couldn't have them using croissants. I had to find some other kinds of foods. But I find that the Merriam-Webster was a really good resource.
Yeah, and like I say, because I was The Run of Destruction, which is that true crime story about my best running friend, because I lived this situation, I did write manufactured dialogue in this between myself and my friend based on my memory. So I reenacted them based on those memories, and I created dialogue there. But nobody's ever come back and said, oh, you can't do, that doesn't sound right, because who knows what I said to my friend, you know? So I could use that, and that's how I did this. So this really does, I guess you'd call it manufactured, but it really wasn't. It was based on my memories. So I could do that. In this one, though, I said, this one, Circle of Innocence, is at Door County. That one is all, you know, manufactured dialogue, of course. But just like you're saying, if you make sure that you have it based on the period even, that make sure what you're doing does fit that so it doesn't fall into something that's not going to be believable, okay? But this one, I said there's just one example. Here's the very first chapter. I had no dialogue throughout the whole chapter. It was more narrative. But it says, Mary later testified, because she was in a trial. This is the maid this is a lot of abuse that happened in this with a physician. She says, he looked at my tongue and looked on my pulse and gave me medicine. Now, we wouldn't say it that way, but this is the way she did it in hers. So then I'm really bringing in the way she would speak from the archival records. And people say, oh, that's bad English. Well, that's the way she did speak. So, and it's in quotes then. So that's how I would bring that in from the archival records.
So, as you've all mentioned kind of an amount of research that's done before you start writing, and then questions, you continue the research. When do you know when you have enough research? And is it possible to have too much?
I think it's never possible to have too much.
I agree.
I start writing right away. I don't know what you two do, but you know, I start laying out just the vague outline and build onto that and start working. And then I'm constantly researching. This week, language-wise, I was researching, because it's not just the time frame that a word is used, but regionally where it's used. And somebody commented that I used the word dinner in referring to the evening meal, but in rural areas, dinner is at the noon meal, and supper is in the evening. But in regionally, it could be different. Dinners are formal meals. So in France, they would have their meals like at 10 in the evening, really big fancy ones, and those were dinners. And you know, I'm working on the editing of the second book, and I'm still researching to make sure I've got the details correct. So for me, it goes on the whole time.
I'm now creating the characters for my book, and so giving them their own personality and their own stories, giving them an occupation and a career. So that's requiring a lot of research. But to me, as I come up to it, then I need to go back and develop all of that and really find out more about what I'm talking about. So.
Well, you know, I was going to say, I teach a research class up in Door County, right on Door County, and I teach a class on saying when do you know, how can you stop researching? Because I have a lot of people that come to my class that have researched for 20 years, and they tell me all about this exciting story, but they've never written anything yet. So there's a lot of people that love to research and they don't know how to write. So it's really important to start writing something, at least getting a formulation and things. But I do find that I get way too much research that I can't use. I truly do. So then what I do is, in this last book, I decided what my themes were for the book. So in this one ended up being wealth versus poverty, men's entitlement versus women's liberty, and false information versus scientific fact. So I had 3 themes. So then if my research did not hit those themes and it was going off on tangents, I removed it or set it aside, and I might use it in another book. But right now, that's what I did, is I really wanted to keep it moving and really keeping it with what was important to the story. So the themes were really important to me. That's how I weeded out the stuff I shouldn't use. Okay.
I do think that most authors I talk to who do a lot of research, they don't use all the research that they use. Sometimes you know a lot about a character or a lot about a time period or a lot about a place, and it helps inform your writing, but it doesn't necessarily end up in the writing. I think the writing is better for it because you have this sense of what things were like, but you can't put everything into it or you end up with a really, really long thing and with things that don't need to be there.
I think it's important to immerse yourself in your subject, and after that, whether you use it or not, it still comes out in the story in whatever way it's supposed to.
So, Lynda, you've mentioned a few times when the historic record simply didn't have what you needed, and I wondered if there were times for each of the authors up here where there just wasn't enough information, and how did you deal with that?
See, in my case, what you can do is this. If you're writing nonfiction, you can say perhaps, okay? You're allowed to say perhaps. So you're not saying it really did, but based on all the knowledge and everything you gathered there, you think perhaps this is it. So like, I'll say, how did Mary find, Mary was trying to find her attorney for the case. I don't know. She ended up with this attorney. She ended up with actually John Olin, who's out of Madison, who was in charge of the parks and all that. This is one of her attorneys. I don't know how she exactly got it, but I can say perhaps she was this, and it's based on knowledge. So that's how you can get around with it, but still keep it, get enough information that you can do. And you'll find that in lots of nonfiction, narrative nonfiction. There's a book called The Five, which is about Jack the Ripper's women that were killed by him, and they gave them a life, and quite often they will say perhaps, because they don't know. It's so far back in history, but they can sort of weave it together to make sure that it might have happened that way. Okay.
All right, so now this is for the fiction writers. When writing fiction, what if the facts or the people involved or the timing and event doesn't fit with the story that you're wanting to tell? What do you do?
Well, I'm not writing historical fiction, so that really doesn't apply, but
So yeah, I've encountered that. Sometimes the dates don't quite work the way I want them to. Sometimes the people who are there are not the right people at the right time. What I try to do is to fashion it so that it's still logical. And then I have an author's note in my book, and I make note of where I have veered from the fact and what really went on at the time, or what resource they can go to if they want something more in depth. But I have the luxury as a fiction writer to play around with reality, but you don't want to go so far away from it that it becomes unbelievable. So you have to work within structures that are still logical, and then own up. I feel you have to own up to it.
I am creating a medical situation in my book for one of my characters right now. And of course I'm a former hospice nurse and so I had a situation that I recall very vividly that I'm basing this on, but I wanted to be really sure that that's still the way that this would be handled, or if treatment has gone in a different direction. I have spent the entire week researching the NHPCO and all sorts of different things for some real accurate medical information about it. I still may write it the way I want to, but at least I know, I don't want to open myself to I don't know, just not knowing what's current, so.
You know, I have one situation, again, in the latest book, that the courtroom trial was lost to history, okay? Now, there was newspaper articles, but there was not the real trial that's there anymore in the books, in the records I found. But the 94 pages of deposition between the maid and an attorney was in there. So what I did is and that's back and forth all over the place, so I had to put it logically, and I created because I found out that in deposition, most often most of the questions are used in a trial. So then I talked to an attorney and said, if I would be doing this, and what I was going to do is put in the notes, and I did recreate the trial from the deposition. But I do put that in the notes at the back that I use the deposition, and every single thing in quotes is exactly what was in the records, but it just happened to be in the deposition and not in the trial. But I was able to put that, like I say, in the back of the book, and they think that was just absolutely fine to do it. Because then you made your jury trial, everything come alive again, other than just reporting on it. Okay, that's how I did it.
Do you end up using footnotes?
No.
Or just general notes in the back, or just an author's note?
Yeah, I'm still not a true historian. If I was like had an MFA and whatever and things like that, I don't have that. So I do have, pages and pages of things in the back on it, but I did not do footnotes. I think it really detracts from the story as you're reading. And if you look at, for instance, Devil in the White City, if people have read, so that starts to take place in the same year as this book. And Devil in the White City, he does not do footnotes all the way through it all. It's just in the back of the book, okay? And that makes you read the book like a narrative, like a exciting book, instead of always the footnotes. Yeah.
Are we going to have a fight about footnotes?
You don't use them either, do you?
No, not in fiction.
No.
But I was just curious because
Yeah.
I've read some biographies and things that will use them, but I kind of like the idea that with narrative nonfiction, you're just dealing with structuring the story and then having something in the back. Because I do like, when I read nonfiction, I do like to find out, I like to go back to sources. So I'm always looking for the notes and things, but I don't need footnotes.
So that makes me wonder, Marggie, you write a memoir, or is it a biography?
These two are memoir style. Yeah, the first one is simply a memoir of my mother's hospice journey and her death and dying. But the second one is a more focused book where it's dealing with death and dying, and based on things that I had worked in. However, each chapter was designed to elicit a certain spiritual component of the death and dying process, with meditative journaling prompts at the end of it and things like that. So it required a lot of, well, like I said, moving facts around, and so that they could not be everything that happened in there is true, but not exactly as it seems. Let's put it that way. It's creative nonfiction. But yeah, it just depends upon what you're doing. For my book now is completely fiction. It's the story I'm creating. But it also, one of the things that the characters will be doing is sacred circles and doing some rituals. And so I got a book on some of my own ancestral rituals that would have been for Celtic rituals. And so we'll see how I use that, but those are the kind of information that I'm gathering now. So
my question was going to be, were there instances where you remembered something or remembered your mother telling you something, but then as you researched the instance or something like that, that there was conflicting information?
Not in that case.
Okay.
I will say when my siblings read it, they said, boy, we're from different families, because everybody had their own version of the story. And that to me goes without saying. This is my memory of those events, so.
I'm going to just mention one thing too. This was actually, it's a true crime, but it was my memoir. But what's really interesting when you are writing it, you are having to go delve deep into your own environment. Some of it is not positive. Some things are really disturbing, but you have to bring that out. And that is your own internal research, I would call it, that you're having to go through. And you have to really present that correctly. Otherwise, you're not telling the right story. So it's a hard process, I think, when you get into memoir type of writing, that you have to really dig deep into things that maybe you don't even want to share sometimes, but you got to share them because that's what it is. Okay, so.
So along that line, do you need to get permission to tell or retell a story? I mean, sometimes it might be scandalous or controversial or different from how other people remembered it. Is that ever a concern in your work?
Well, like I said, my memoir about my mother's journey was my story about that, and I didn't need anybody's permission. However, I did send it out to my entire family before I ever went to publish it, to make sure that any feelings and they all thumbs up across the board, But this book, like I said, every single situation is completely true, but completely, I had to move things around, different locations, different genders, different years, all those kinds of things, because those are confidential. When you're invited into somebody's life during those weeks and months, that belongs right there and nowhere else. So.
Well, I had this one. I first started to write as fiction. Okay, Run to Destruction, and I found out through an attorney that if I told it as fiction and kept it in Green Bay, I would be sued. So. Could not do that because that is you always have to say the characters are not recognizable or they're used fictitiously, and this was not being used that way. So I had to start all over again, and I wrote it as true. And then you won't get sued if you tell the truth. So that's what you have to decide is how you're going to do it. So if I wanted to write this, I could have put it in LA or something and changed it, but I didn't really want to do that. So that was a problem if I did it that way. So a lot of people were surprised that that's what you have to do. Now this one is a nonfiction as well, but I still felt responsible because one of them is Dr. Minahan, who's the top surgeon in Green Bay, that buildings were named for him, stadiums were named for him, everything. He's the bad guy that I uncovered all the abuse. So I went back to his immediate family, which one of them still lives here in Madison, and talked to him and wanted to make sure, even though I knew I could write it, I am allowed to, but I still didn't want to create issues. And he gave me his permission that nobody in their family would sue me, even though they really couldn't. And he's First Amendment rights and all those things. And then the Maid, I found her family as well, and that story for the Maid has been whispered about for generations in their family. She was just very pleased I was going to write it. Okay, where in the Minahan side, when I talked to the Minahan descendant, he knew nothing about these cases. It had been hidden in history from their family, which is the rich people, and then the poor people knew about the thing about the abuse. So that was quite interesting. So that's where you have to, I think it's just on you to make sure that you do the right thing by asking people, but you don't necessarily have to have permission, but I would prefer to have it so that I don't feel bad about what I did and what I wrote. So that's what I do.
I think listening to you, Lynda, brings up a point. You were writing a story about that situation. When I wrote Life is a Prayer, it was intended to talk about end of life and to help people to start to prepare in their own minds and spiritually start to become more open to what's going on. It was a completely different focus. So I'm not telling those stories just to tell them. It was just making situations that would exemplify, the different things.
It's obviously easier the farther you go back in history. but it can still come up. Generally, it's said that if what you are writing is in the newspapers, then that's public knowledge, and you can use it. I think you still have to be very careful not to inadvertently malign somebody, even with that sort of thing. So yeah.
So let's go back a little bit. We were talking about an author's note or acknowledgments, and when writing a book that requires research, do you have to have an author's note? And what should go in it, and how is it different than an acknowledgement, and all that?
So I include an author's note that talks about my inspiration and how I've deviated from the facts. And I let that kind of blend itself into the acknowledgments, where I am thanking the people who helped me on my journey to write, where I thank people that helped me with research. I've seen some authors' notes that will list the books that they've used. I don't go to that extent, but I do try to thank everybody that's contributed in some way. You certainly don't have to have either. I'm a reader who likes to read those. I often will read the acknowledgments in a book to see who influenced that writer. I certainly will almost always read the author's note, unless it's very academic, then maybe I won't. But in something like what Lynda's writing, I want to know a little bit more about what the author's mindset was. So if you're published by a big publisher, they might require it. If you're self-publishing, it's totally up to you. And even mine is with a smaller independent publisher, and they didn't have a requirement, but I think they appreciated that I had it.
I enjoy reading those too. You get a little flavor of the author and all that went into the book, and the motivation and things like that. It makes it very real.
Yeah, and the first one I wrote, I didn't use an author's note. I think it was so personal already because I'm a character in the story. Mm-hmm. So I didn't need it, I don't think. I always make a book club question list because I always think it's important if you write these kind of books, if you can get them into book clubs, and lots of people read my books for book clubs. So that's just a point. Any book you write, if you can make it a book club book, is great. Mm-hmm. So this one, though, I felt like because I was telling the story of these women, and I'm not in it, that's why the author's note was so important to me at the end. So now I tell the inspiration, why one of the people lived in my house, and that kind of thing. And then I also bring it back to how the book today, how those themes that I have currently, the men's entitlement versus women's liberty, and wealth versus poverty, and false information versus scientific fact, we're back in this era, like in 1890s and up to 1925, and then I brought it back to today's environment and saying how relevant it is today. So that's an author's note, can also bring it back to something you give your own analysis then of what this can mean to you from the story. So I think that's another part of the author's note that you can use, okay?
Okay, and then the last question that we have prepared is, what about AI? What are your thoughts on using AI to gather information or through any part of the writing process?
I have tried it. I have tried, I think Bing uses something called Copilot. And it was so general that I ended up going and researching to see if it was accurate. So for me, it was kind of a waste of time. I like to pick through my own resources. I don't like things summarized for me. And everything I've read about AI it's really not trustworthy because it's not distinguishing what is fact versus what is fiction. And my feeling about AI is, as it grows, things that that are out there that are not accurate, that gets picked up by AI, it's just going to get amplified as if it was accurate. So I'm not a fan of it. You know, the one thing I've used it for is I wanted to visualize what something would look like in the new book, having to do with snowshoes. My characters go to midnight mass in 1670, whatever, and they're going on snowshoes, and they've got their torches that I researched what, you know, how they would light their way. And I checked with somebody, you know, would they put their snowshoes up in the snow? And my expert says, well, yeah, because if they lay them flat, they might lose them. So I have them, and this was my own creation, I have them put their snowshoes on the path leading up to the church, and then they stick their torches behind them and they go in. And I just wanted to see what that could look like. So I asked AI to create the scene for me. And it gave me several visuals, most of which looked really hokey and silly, but it was kind of like, oh, well, here's one way it could look. But I certainly wouldn't use that in the book at all. And it wasn't even informing my writing. It was just more to play with the idea.
Well, I honestly, even using the internet personally is not really very good research, okay? You might say it's easy to Google and find all these things, but you can never believe it. The only thing I really believe, even newspapers like .com, when I go there, oh my gosh, they use the wrong names and everything all over the place. It's just hard because there's so much bad information. I still think, and I'll still reference, you know, the Devil in the White City. The only things he uses are really from real written books and real written documents that you found in some place. So that's where I still think you've got to be very careful. And AI brings in all this stuff, and you just don't know it yet. Now, probably in the future it's going to make a difference. But right now it's too new, I think, to use it and believe it, I think, at this point. Okay? So I don't use it either.
I don't have much experience with it, but recently I was invited to speak at a conference, and they sent back the publication of what I said. This isn't even close to what I said I'm going to be talking about. And she said, oh, that's because I used AI. And I thought, well, you're going to have to change it because it doesn't even begin to talk about what I really want to say. So,
I've gotten to where sometimes I can tell if an article that I'm researching something is written by AI. There's just something about the way it's written. I do use Wikipedia. I use it to get an overview, and I often will look at the citations at the end.
Yeah.
So I think even Wikipedia, anything, well, like you said, newspapers make mistakes.
Oh, yeah.
You can read somebody's private letters, and it's going to be told either from their point of view, or like you said with your family, they have different impressions, different memories of what happened. So it's really hard to get it accurate. But to throw in that whole other universe of potential inaccuracy, I think really does a disservice.
You know, there was one other thing, I know one of the questions here, I just wanted to bring out. Because, you know, you're working on things with the characters. You're talking so much about characters in your stories and so on. And, you know, and I've got true, real people that existed. And like I say, in this last book, they dealt with abuse, okay? The woman did, both women did, you know, it was sexual, mental, all sorts of things, okay? And then the physician was really, he's the abuser, right? But I grew up in a family, a good family. I gotta say, I didn't have any abuse. I didn't know that kind of stuff. So you're starting to research on that. So the way I did it is this, and I thought this was really, really helpful. I just bring it up quite often with people. I found a therapist in Madison, actually, and she would read one chapter of my book. I would do it over Zoom. So I would do a Zoom call, and she's looking at my chapter, and I'm reading it. This is it wasn't polished totally yet. She'd read it, and She said, Lynda, your character would not think like that. I know this from this. And you realize this man is a narcissist. I didn't even know what that meant. And she said, do you know he's doing gaslighting? She was so helpful all the way through. Every single chapter really helped. So I just think that was probably the best research I've ever done in character development, is working with somebody that is so knowledgeable in that area that can bring that character alive. And now you feel these characters and what they're going through. Otherwise, they were flat. And then I learned. So I just say that's my best, to me, that was my best advice ever, is to find somebody who's an expert in that area and maybe go through your book, or whatever you're working with together with them. I think it's really helpful.
I would piggyback that in that I've always been a little bit shy about approaching people, to interview or to do research, but people love it when you come to them and say, I'm writing a novel, and can you share with me? When we did this one, we had a scene on the straits on Door County between Washington Island and the mainland, and we had boats going. And I literally emailed a retired Coast Guard skipper and asked questions, and he was thrilled to answer them for me. And any time that I've had occasion to ask somebody, to share their expertise, I don't think anybody's ever said no.
Yeah.
And, it's like, at first I'm like, oh, they're going to think I'm, crazy for wanting to write a novel or whatever. People love sharing their information. So going to people, talking to people, emailing people is a great, great research strategy.
I had beta readers too before I ever went any further to publication. So,
do people know what a beta reader is? So when you're writing, you get someone who will read the whole thing afterwards. And usually, I think more than one person should read it.
and that was beyond the editing. This is just to make sure that everything, and you get people knowledgeable in your subject matter, which is very helpful.
So did we have any questions from the audience?
I have a follow-up question on that topic. When you spoke to a therapist, and you also mentioned speaking to an attorney, and did you pay them?
Yeah, the therapist I was working with every week, she did it for 52 weeks, with me. So, but she charged very reasonable. But you know what? I do. I'm using her expertise. That's really an expert, okay? Now, if I have a friend that's I have a friend that's a physician, right? And on this one, I had to find some things out. And on this, because it's an overriding theme of syphilis for my book, which is terrible to say, but that's what it was. So I talked to a physician and got that. But they were friends, right? They don't charge you. But really, when you get into that much detail and they're going to be willing to spend all that time with you, they do. Now, when I had that attorney, too, to find out if I could publish it and all that, I had to pay the attorney just to tell me that, too. So, yeah, you do have to pay for some of it. But, in the long run, it's really worth it if you get a better product out of it.
And if you're doing this as a professional, that's just what you do, and yeah.
And do you have do you get if someone beta reads for you or something, or if you're banking on specific expertise, do you get them a present or something, or a little a gift card or anything? Not paying them hourly or anything, but you get them a thank you.
You mean just like a friend or whatever you mean that would help you, like a physician friend or something?
Yeah, I guess someone who didn't charge you for your time, and then if you got them, I was wondering if anyone had a standard, I always just get them $30 to Amazon.
You know what you do is you acknowledge them in your book, and they love it. Okay, that's really that's the gift card.
Yeah, you acknowledge them, and maybe you're going to give them a signed copy or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
I recently asked a gentleman who's part of the Ojibwe Nation to read my new novel because there's so many characters in there that are First Peoples of Canada. And I said, do you charge? They call them a sensitivity reader. And usually they will. And he just said, no, but if you want to make a donation to my department, that's fine. And so, yeah, of course I will do that. But I do think you're right, acknowledging people is actually the best way to thank them.
Because you're asking them to read your book and with a keen eye. So this is not just, something to take lightly. It's a great service.
I've had people that have worked with me, and I've taken them out to dinner as a thank you, or given them a bottle of wine or something. It's all very individual.
Right. Question on across the board. Some of you said you self-publish, which is very common these days. Others have used publishing.
The library will be closing in 30 minutes.
Time to go.
How do you determine what is the best approach based on the type of writing, or what and how long does it take you to write a book was another question I thought of.
Long time.
I can start here. My books take almost 5 years to write, research and write, and then get out, And I used small publishers for 3 of them that paid for all the expenses and everything, but you make very little and the end result from those kind of publishers, okay? My last one, I got a New York agent and everything. They went all over to all the major publishing houses, and they loved it, but it was too regional, so they wouldn't take it. In the end, I went with somebody out of Little Creek Press right in this area that she did it for me, and I really think it's wonderful what she did. So and this one I'm making 10 times more than I made in all the rest of my books, and by doing this, it's what you would call self-published. But so it's just different. In my next book I'm going to do, I don't think I want to go through the agent and all that again. Is such a process. It's a huge process. And as you get older, you don't want to waste that much time on this either. So my next one I'm working on, I'm going to probably do exactly how I did this one because I really like what I got out of it. But I did use an editor through Reedsy. Now you pay for it out of Reedsy, and she works for Penguin Books. So she's a professional editor out of Penguin Books. I paid her through that Reedsy site, but she was a really good editor. She gave me so much. It's not line editing, it's more like content editing. So she would say, Lynda, this is where you should bring out farming in the late 1890s. And she'd tell me all these things to bring out, and she knew all sorts of things on eugenics. She was just really good with the period of my book. So I still recommend you pay for some of those things, but you still will make a lot more in your book if you do a good job with it, if it's really done well too. So I think you still pay for it, but you pay for it and you pay for it up front, but you make more money out of it. Where these, I just didn't hardly make any money on. This one, I finally got my rights back though, and I picked up 20,000. I mean, not 20,000. It was 20 cases of my book that were still with my publisher, 36 in them out of Missouri. And when this book came out, I still had all these boxes left of these books still because she never paid me. So when I got this back, since this book came out, all of these have sold, and I've gotten about 20 more cases of this book now that I couldn't publish. So that's the other thing is once you get one book out that's good, your back sell list will come through too. So those are just some tips, okay?
I do think it's very individual. Depends on your hopes, your dreams, your wants. I think what you said about you get to a certain stage at life. So it took me about 3 years to write this book. I found an agent surprisingly quickly. She showed it to all the big houses. I got lots of compliments. Nobody would buy it.
Was that your first book?
It was my first solo project. I had already independently published these. Took about 1.5 to 2 years to go through that process. Mm-hmm. And I said, she said, I've gone everywhere. And so I said, well, I'm going to try the independent small presses. Do you want to be part of that journey? And she actually said no, because my percentage will draw too much from what you'll get. And of course with the small presses, if you get an advance at all, it's going to be very small. I didn't get an advance. Sometimes with the big 5 companies, your release date's going to be about 2 years out. When I signed for this one, they gave me a release date 9 months out. The new one now, the release date is maybe 15 months out, but much, much quicker. I independently published these, and I don't regret it. I like getting the little check from Amazon. Some people are very successful, depending on their genre and depending on their marketing savvy. Some people will say, I don't want to go through a press because I want the proceeds. I don't want to share it with the publisher. I didn't want to have to go through what I went through with these. So it really, there are people who prefer to self-publish. There are many of us who are happy with small press, and there are people who have dreams of the big press, and they're lucky. You know, to me, it's like winning the lottery.
Well, each of my books took about 2 to 3 years to write, but with this book, I did try. I thought, okay, I'm going to give it one shot, like with Hay House, with the spiritually, type of books, and it was enormously time-consuming to get all the documentation to submit to them to even be considered. I can't remember which group I actually submitted to, but because they would let me know within a reasonable time amount, when they sent the letter saying no thanks, then during that time my brother died, and so I thought, I've done all this work, I am just getting it out there, and so that's what I did. Then it was the right decision.
If you go with an agent, the agent, yep, they take 15% or whatever, 20%. They do protect your rights and all that. If you go with a small press and you need to have your contract looked at, there's an organization called the Authors Guild. They're nonprofit. They have attorneys. And as long as you promise you will join them for at least 2 years, their attorneys are free. So that's a really good source. Independently, self-published people don't usually face that at all. It's possible, like your questions could have been posed to the same kind of attorneys at the Authors Guild, but there's plenty of resources.
Right.
I think to pay an attorney to go over your contract could be quite expensive. And to me, to have all the resources from the Authors Guild along with their attorneys for free, and they did a nice job of going over the contract for me.
And I do want to mention too, because so this, I do consider this self-published. I used Little Creek for the cover and all that, and the formatting. I could have done it myself, but she did a really good job, and it just was nice to have her do it. But so it gets out there anyway, and I'm just saying, it's just my book, but now it's already been, Amazon picked it up 3 times now for like a book of the month. They did, I'm on one right now for 4 months for the Kindle. It's on the, I don't know what it's called, Prime Read. So look at, these are just, I did this myself, right? Which is really interesting. Then Tantor Media called me, and it's now an audiobook. They paid for it and gave me an advance on it. So I'm saying you can still go this other route and still really make a successful book. So I don't think you need to necessarily ever go to the big houses now, even though they want you to think that, but you don't really get much from them. Okay, and then this one too. This was a little small press, but the ID channel and Netflix picked it up as a true crime segment. They paid me for those things to do that and go work with them on it. So again, these are small things you can still get out there. I'm just saying I think it gives people hope that you can do more than, it doesn't just disappear because you did it yourself. Okay.
We have about 5 minutes until the next announcement. Any other questions from the audience?
I guess one thing I wanted to get opinions on would be the real travel versus researching on the internet? Because of course, I mean, I'm writing some things where things are happening all over the world, and I would love to go, but can't afford to. So I'm wondering what, and I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, but what all of you think about how far you can go with just going on Google Maps, reading about it online, or watching virtual tours and things like that.
You can do a lot. I mean, I had been to France twice, but very, very long ago. And so everything I did for this book was virtual. For the Boston book, I'd been to Boston, and I'd been to the places that, in fact, I had one image of what the Longfellow House looked like in Cambridge, and when I went to visit it, it was so different that I'm so glad I went. And I've been in the Old North Church. I've literally rung the bell. I've gone down into the crypt, and I would never have understood what all that was like if I hadn't done it in person. I've been up to Quebec for the new book coming out. So when you can, it will make a huge, huge difference. But when you can't, well, then we live in a wonderful world where there's an awful lot you can figure out.
And like you had mentioned earlier with YouTube videos, there's a lot. You can find a YouTube video in the city that you're trying to do or whatever. Somebody's walking, even narrating it. If you look hard enough, you're going to find a lot of it now, and you can put yourself in those shoes to do it. But if you can experience something, even touch, being anywhere and touch it or feel it or see and look at the lighting, and I don't know, it still is very beneficial, I gotta say though.
Yeah.
If you can be there. But that's nowadays, they're second best now with YouTube videos. We didn't used to have that, so.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you to our wonderful authors for sharing your expertise and all the information. I enjoyed myself. I hope you all did as well. Thank you.
Thank you.